Hello, my name is Kelsey Allen. I am going to be presenting for you today my capstone project for the MSN program at WGU. The title of my project is Bridging the Gap, Emergency Department New Graduate Nurse Participation in Interdisciplinary Critical Care Patient Simulation. We'll start by just giving you a little bit of an introduction into the capstone project. So my assignment was to identify a gap in nursing education within the unit that I work. I am a nurse at the University of Kansas Health System in the emergency department. I just want to start by giving you a little bit of a background on the hospital so that you understand where the gap really came from. The University of Kansas Health System is a large academic medical center in Kansas City, Kansas. It is rapidly expanding. They offer specialties in ENT, neurology. It's a cardiac care center, a burn center, trauma center, neurology, transplants. So in the emergency department, we see, and throughout the hospital, we see a wide variety of patient populations. And many of those patients present to the emergency department as their point of access for the hospital. So that means that nurses in the ER really need to have a wide variety of skills and a good knowledge set in order to efficiently and effectively and safely care for these patients. In the past couple of years, the University of Kansas Health System has been expanding rapidly. And along with that, the emergency department has expanded within the last couple of years from a 26-bed ER to a 43-bed ER. And with that expansion came the need to hire more staff. And the department made the decision to begin hiring new graduate nurses right out of school. The new graduate nurses at the University of Kansas Hospital participate in a residency program where they attend monthly meetings and they do unit-specific education with the unit educators each month after their meetings. The emergency department, new graduate nurses actually go a step further and receive education weekly from the unit educator in 4-hour classroom type sessions, just in order to ensure that they are able to care for all of these different types of patients that we're seeing in the emergency department. So through this program, we have identified that the new graduate nurses coming off of orientation are still really struggling with and really insecure with their knowledge and skills while caring for a critically ill patient. And they are especially uncomfortable as a leader on the interdisciplinary team when caring for their patient, or even just as a member of the interdisciplinary team when caring for their patient. And so the population that we identified for this project was the new graduate nurses. And what we wanted to address was their fears and insecurities caring for critically ill patients. We wanted to be able to address interdisciplinary communication issues, their knowledge, procedural skills when caring for these patients, and leadership skills. So in order to address this gap, we came up with the idea of creating an interdisciplinary critical care simulation that would use department members from each of the disciplines that are represented in the care of a critically ill patient in the emergency department. So I identified that staff, those interdisciplinary team members, as, of course, the new graduate nurses, our target population, physicians, the residents that work with the physicians, respiratory therapists, and pharmacists. Those are our main groups of interdisciplinary team members that we wanted involved in this simulation. The focus of the simulation was to develop new graduate nursing knowledge and skills. This simulation is to give them an opportunity to practice nursing skills. It's a safe place for them to make mistakes without harming a patient, as well as a safe place for them to receive effective feedback and learn and grow from that. in this simulation, the patient is coming in by EMS in respiratory distress. It is the new graduate nurse's job to identify respiratory distress when the patient arrives, and notify the physician, and let RT know, or notify RT to be at the bedside in case any intubation is necessary. So the nurse will receive initial orders from the physician or the resident involved in the simulation and carry out their nursing tasks. At which point the patient would show signs of progressing from respiratory distress to respiratory failure. These are signs that we would want the new graduate nurse to be able to identify in the patient, and they would then have the responsibility of relaying that information to the physician or the resident, and letting the respiratory therapist and the pharmacist know that we need to prepare for an impending intubation on this patient once the order is received from the physician. So during the intubation, the new graduate nurse would be responsible for assigning roles to the other nurses in the room that are helping with take care of the patient. Those roles could be things like starting or making sure that the IV is patent, drawing labs, giving medications, talking to the patient, making sure that the vital signs are running, and getting everything documented, or just getting set up for the intubation. And part of those responsibilities would fall onto the new graduate nurse, but it is also their responsibility to delegate those tasks to the appropriate members of the care team. Then the new graduate nurse would be expected to assist with the intubation and provide and or delegate any post-intubation care that the patient might need. And that would include post-intubation sedation medications or pain medicine. It might include the placement of a Foley catheter if they receive an order from the physician. It could be drawing labs or checking serial ABGs and collaborating with the respiratory therapist to make sure that the settings on the ventilator are actually helping the patient. Could be placement of an OG tube or a nasogastric tube. Any of those things that are possible for a nurse to be doing post-care. And then at the end of the simulation, the entire team would participate in a debriefing session where they would talk about what kind of things went right, what went wrong, what can we do better, how do we think this is going to help our patients, what do we need to do differently next time, all those different things. And I think the debriefing session will be really helpful for the nurses, and it's a really valuable part of the learning process for them to be able to have a safe space to discuss with the interdisciplinary team the things that they saw during the simulation. So I really didn't have a hard time finding much evidence to support the use of simulation as an effective teaching tool. This particular means of education is widely used in nursing education already, not only in the United States, but around the world. Nursing schools have been using simulations for nurses and to improve their education processes, as well as partnering with medical schools, pharmacy schools, respiratory therapy schools, to put together interdisciplinary simulations for students in school. And this idea is also being used within hospitals to put together simulations for interdisciplinary teams in ICUs and emergency departments, pediatrics, you name it. So the literature very much supports the use of simulation as an effective teaching strategy. Goldsworthy actually showed that the use of simulation improves knowledge and increases the learner confidence in actual patient situations. And then another study done by Bullard showed that the use of simulation actually improves procedural skills for the people that are involved, which is why we want to have the new graduate nurse, performing those nursing skills post-intubation or pre-intubation in the simulation process. It was really important to us that we did involve interdisciplinary teams from the emergency department in this simulation, because interdisciplinary simulation is a proven tool to promote learning in a variety of disciplines. So this isn't just beneficial to the new graduate nurse, it's beneficial to the entire team, and when the team works well, the patients do better. These interdisciplinary simulations have been shown to enhance teamwork and collaboration. They improve communication across disciplines, and they also promote safe practice. They promote positive patient outcomes, which is essentially the goal for the emergency department and for the hospital at large. So now I just want to talk a little bit about the implementation plan, really the steps that we went through to get this simulation going. So throughout this process, it will take about a year of planning to get this off the board and really get this rolling. The whole process started with a meeting with the unit educator in the emergency department, the manager, and a mentor that I used for this capstone project. The goal of this meeting was to identify a gap in nursing education, which, as we noted, was the care of a critically ill patient on their own. And the unit educator actually had a lot of insight into the needs of the new graduate nurse, and she is and will be an integral part of making this process work and making the simulation really as good as it can be. So once we identified the gap in nursing education, I just did a thorough review of the literature. I was looking for research that supported simulation as a use of as an effective learning tool, and specifically something that was that supported it as a tool for teaching nurses and for interdisciplinary team building. And the review of literature also helped me to gather enough support to propose the simulation to the powers that be at KU. So once I had that all ready to go, it was my job to then obtain department approval from my manager and the hospital leaders. After that, we went ahead and scheduled a meeting with the interdisciplinary team leaders. The point of meeting with interdisciplinary team members is really just to gain buy-in from them. We need them on our side, and we want them involved in the process of planning because they can offer a lot of insight into what they need from the new graduate nurses or in nursing in general, and what kind of trends they see, what they would like to see us learning, and what their needs are for the simulation as well. These meetings, it's not just one meeting, it's probably a couple of meetings that take place over about 2 or 3 months with the interdisciplinary team. And the goal of these meetings is to identify the outcomes for the simulation. So what do we really want the new graduate nurses to know and be able to demonstrate for us, and to brainstorm scenario ideas. So after a couple of meetings, we would formulate a rough draft of the simulation script, and then that script would be turned into the Zamorowski Institute for Experiential Learning, or ZEAL. So the hospital, KU Hospital, is very blessed to have this partnership with KU School of Nursing and KU Med School, and they partnered a few years ago to put together and build a large health education building that houses a simulation hospital, and that simulation hospital is ran by the Zamorowski Institute for Experiential Learning. They have a template that we would follow for submission of our simulation ideas. Their template says that it would take about 12 to 16 weeks to implement the simulation at this point. So we would submit that simulation plan template for review and approval from Zeal, and meet with them to see what suggestions they have for us from there. After that, we would meet once again as an interdisciplinary team to make any adjustments to the script or to the simulation that we need to, any improvements, any changes, based on those recommendations from Zeal. The next step, according to Zeal, is to host a pilot simulation. And the pilot simulation involves, it's really just like a mock simulation, which would involve members of the interdisciplinary team, and probably the unit educator and myself acting as the new graduate nurses. And we would do a run through of the simulation like it would be on the actual simulation day. This allows us some time to iron out some kinks, decide if we really like the script, if we need to change anything, if there's things missing, is there technology that we don't know how to use or that we need to be integrating into the simulation for the following week. The next week we would host the actual simulation event. The nurses would arrive, new graduate nurses would arrive with other members of the interdisciplinary team. Those members would be assigned by the interdisciplinary team leaders who have been helping with the planning process this whole time. And the team members involved would have no idea what the scenario is going to be along with the new graduate nurses. Upon arrival to the Zeal Hospital, the students or the new graduate nurses and the interdisciplinary team would be provided with a tour of the simulation hospital and allowed some time to familiarize themselves with the high fidelity patient simulators, and they would also receive a pre-simulation debriefing, briefing, in order to get some background on the patient that they're going to be taking care of that day. After the simulation event, they would then participate in a debriefing session that we'll talk about a little bit later. So as part of the lesson plan, I have to identify the topic. Again, the topic for this lesson is an interdisciplinary simulation of a critically ill patient in the emergency department. The objectives for the new graduate nurse are: by the end of the simulation, the new graduate nurse will identify and verbalize 3 signs and symptoms that a patient condition is deteriorating. Throughout the simulation, the new graduate nurse will communicate all changes in patient condition to the appropriate members of the interdisciplinary team. And at the end of the simulation, the new graduate nurse will appropriately identify and complete the necessary post-intubation procedures to be performed and delegate tasks appropriately. The teaching and instructional strategies used for this lesson are simulation, of course, collaborative learning with the use of the interdisciplinary teams, and reflection and critical incident analysis, which happens in the debriefing session after the simulation. So there are some required materials that the students will or the new graduate nurses, will have to take a look at and familiarize themselves prior to coming to the simulation day. These first 2 videos that are provided give the students an introduction, the new graduate nurses an introduction into what a high fidelity patient simulator is. One of the videos talks a lot about like the technology itself and what to expect out of a simulation event. And the other video gives them a really good idea of the capabilities of the high fidelity patient simulator that they will be working with. And then the third resource that the new graduate nurses have is provided by the Zeal Simulation Hospital. And this is just a PowerPoint that they can look through that has a map of the hospital. It talks a lot about how what the goals of simulation are, and the mission of the hospital, and it talks specifically about the capabilities of the high fidelity patient simulators at the Zeal Hospital, because they have many different types of patient simulators. So I've identified 5 learning outcomes that these students or the new graduate nurses should be obtaining. The first one is that the new graduate nurse will identify the signs and symptoms of a declining patient while taking the appropriate nursing actions to stabilize them. The new graduate nurse will display professional nursing behaviors while interacting with an interdisciplinary team. The new graduate nurse will demonstrate effective communication and leadership skills while caring for the critically ill patient. And finally, the new graduate nurse will appropriately identify and demonstrate necessary patient care skills post-intubation. And then the fourth one, which I missed, was the new graduate nurse will collaborate with the interdisciplinary team to deliver safe, quality care for the critically ill patient. So the lesson plan, as you can imagine, for the simulation is quite detailed. I've identified 10 concepts based on the outcomes that the new graduate nurses should be able to identify from the lesson itself. So the first concept addresses outcome 1, that the new graduate nurse may be able to identify a patient in severe respiratory distress progressing to full respiratory failure. They will be able to communicate signs and symptoms of a deteriorating patient condition to the physician. This addresses outcomes 1 and 3. Collaborate with pharmacy to prepare intubation medications, addressing outcomes 2 and 4. Communicate with the respiratory therapist to prepare the patient for intubation, outcome 4. Ensuring the patient is prepared for intubation, including appropriate pre-oxygenation and patent intravenous lines, which also addresses outcome 4. Addressing outcome 4 and 5 is a new graduate nurse will assist the physician with intubation. Addressing outcome 5, the new graduate nurse will verify proper placement of an endotracheal tube. They will also be able to identify and complete correct post-intubation nursing procedures, including oral gastric tube placement and induction of post-sedation medications. That addresses outcome 5, as well as this next one, delegating post-intubation procedures to the appropriate interdisciplinary staff members. And finally, participation in post-simulation reflection and discussion with the interdisciplinary team, which addresses outcomes 3 and 4. The new graduate nurses will be required to participate in 2 learning activities for this lesson. The first is an experiential learning activity that is not graded. This involves the new graduate nurse spending time in the hospital skills lab, where they have the opportunity to work with the high fidelity patient simulators, practicing their nursing procedural skills, such as IV placement, Foley catheter placement, OG tube placement, wound dressing changes, whatever they feel that they need to practice. They would be required to schedule that on their own time, and to spend 1 hour to 2 hours with the patient simulators, familiarizing themselves and practicing those procedural skills. The next learning assignment for the students is a graded learning assignment. In this, the new graduate nurse is expected to answer questions after the simulation in a reflective journal. So the stipulations for this reflective journal is on the rubric, which is provided on this next slide here. That must be a minimum of 3 paragraphs. The responses and content to all of the questions need to be present, and there needs to be evidence of true reflection with robust answers. And then they also need to have no obvious grammar or spelling errors in order to obtain 9 out of 9 on this assignment. They should not have a hard time meeting the minimum requirement for this assignment. They have 7 questions that they need to answer. Each of the questions addresses one of the 5 outcomes for the simulation. And so it requires them to think about each of the outcomes and to reflect on how they really feel about if they were able to meet that outcome. For example, one of the questions says, describe how you communicated effectively or ineffectively with the interdisciplinary team members. They have to answer also, describe your attitude towards caring for a critically ill patient before and after the simulation event. Has your attitude changed or stayed the same? And another one is, how did performing procedural skills on the high fidelity patient simulator change your attitude towards performing procedural skills on live patients? Are you more or less confident to perform these skills? Why? So that's just 3 of the 7 questions. And so like I said, if they're really thinking about the answers to those questions, it should not be hard for them to reach the minimum 3 paragraphs. And this also will give us some really good insight into how effective this simulation was at educating the new graduate nurses, and if it really hit on all of their needs prior to leaving orientation and becoming nurses on their own. So next I'm just going to talk a little bit about the evaluation plan for the simulation. So in order to evaluate the success of the simulation, the new graduate participants will fill out a survey following the simulation. They will rank each outcome on a Likert type scale, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree, with disagree, neutral, and agree in the middle. And the survey questions will address both the course content and the learning experience itself. So the students will be asked questions about organization of the course content, clarity of the expectations, usefulness of provided learning resources, how effective was the simulation as a learning strategy, was the course challenging enough, overall satisfaction, is this an effective environment for practicing procedural skills, how did this help develop their nursing knowledge, and did this help with the development of interprofessional communication skills and collaboration. And so the aim of this survey is to really give us, in addition to their reflective journal, some good scalable information about how well the simulation met the needs of the new graduate nurse specifically. And this survey would only be given to the new graduate nurses who participated, since they are the target audience for the simulation. The other interdisciplinary team members were, in this case, just helping with the process and helping train those new graduate nurses. So there were a lot of decision-making processes that go into the planning of the simulation event itself. We made the decision to collaborate with the interdisciplinary teams because we thought that they would add a lot of good information and good knowledge to the simulation planning, or to the simulation script itself. We had to decide which evidence was relevant to our simulation event, and was it good research? Did it really show that this was going to help our new graduate nurses or not? So we had to do some thorough evaluating of that evidence and make decisions on which evidence was really important to us and helpful to us. We had to weigh the pros and cons of doing a simulation. For example, One of the cons is that it's expensive and it takes a really long time to plan an effective simulation. But the pros, the list just goes on and on. You know, it's an effective tool. We have the access to it. You know, all of that is provided in the evidence. So there really wasn't a reason not to do it. We had to make decisions during the revision process of information that needed to be added or taken out of the script or simulation event. And we also had to decide that to use reflection at the end of the simulation event as our measure for effectiveness. So how is the simulation going to inform future outcomes? If this is a successful simulation, we may get feedback from the new graduate nurses or from interdisciplinary team members that we need to expand the simulation to include a more challenging skill set for the new graduate nurses. We may even want to expand to include the learning needs of the interdisciplinary team members so that this simulation doesn't only affect or focus on new graduate nurses. It actually could, you know, grow to include the needs and the learning needs of interdisciplinary team members, the respiratory therapist, the pharmacist, the resident, the physician. Successful feedback may also say that we need to add additional simulation scenarios. So run the new graduate nurses through different patient scenarios rather than just the one for that day. We might have 2 or 3 that we're able to choose from and do with them. Some of the challenges we encountered during this process was how are we really going to meet the learner needs, identifying what the learner needs are, and then how do we meet them. The cost and funding was also a major challenge for us. High fidelity patient simulators are very very expensive to run. Like I said, we have the capability of the Zeal hospital, but that is part of a partnership that the hospital has to continue funding in order for us to have access to it. And they also had to approve the simulation and approve a budget for paying the people who planned it to participate in meetings and to be involved in the planning process. And they also have to pay the new graduate nurses and the interdisciplinary team members for their time spent in the simulation itself. One of the greatest challenges we'll see is accommodating learner styles. Not everybody will get as much out of a simulation event as, not every nurse will get as much out of a simulation event as the next nurse, because everybody has a different learning style. We tried through the resources and through the assignments, the skills lab, the reflective journals, the simulation event itself, the debriefing, all of those are different learning tools that we're using to try to accommodate different learning styles, so that each new graduate nurse gets something out of the simulation. And the final challenge that we will encounter is getting participant buy-in, not only from the interdisciplinary team members, but from the new graduate nurses themselves. It's not exactly easy to pretend like a simulator is a real patient, and it's going to be really important to the effectiveness of the simulation that we're able to get the members of the simulation to buy into really treating the simulation like it's a true patient, the simulator like it's a true patient. So how is the organization going to sustain this process in the short term and in the long term? Well, in the short term, we will need approval to plan and host the simulation, the initial simulation event. we would need them to make this a mandatory process for all of the new graduate nurses to participate in this first year in order to allow us to gather as much data as possible. And they would provide, like I spoke about previously, the funding for this first year of planning, to pay the staff for their time planning the process, and to pay the interdisciplinary team members for their involvement in the simulation event. And we would need the organization to encourage interdisciplinary team member participation. The reality is we can't make the physicians participate, we can't make the pharmacists or the respiratory therapists participate, and so in the infancy of this simulation project, it would be really helpful to have the organization's backup, saying and encouraging those team members to be involved so that they can help enhance the learning of the new graduate nurses, because they're going to be working with them for a long time. In the long term, we would need to secure additional funding to continue the process, and to maybe create new or bigger, longer, more inclusive simulation events. We would need funding and manpower to conduct research on each of the simulation events that we host, because we would want to really get as much information as we can so that we can publish it and help other people create simulations that help their emergency departments. We would love to obtain organizational support for expansion of the simulation to involve meeting the learner needs of the interdisciplinary team members as well. We also would require a policy in the long term that would make it mandatory not only for new graduate nurses to participate in this simulation event, but for interdisciplinary team members to participate with each new graduate nursing class as well. The resources that will be supplied by the hospital are the databases for all of the research that we are conducting. They allow us to use the hospital library and all of the research as employees, and all of the databases. They would also be providing the equipment in the form of the high fidelity patient simulators and the simulation hospital through their partnership with the Zeal Institute. And that is also the venue for the simulation. They would provide meeting spaces throughout the year for us to get together and talk about the simulation and get the planning done. They also would provide, again, funding for the staff and for the simulators themselves. And, of course, the hospital is providing the interdisciplinary team members from the emergency department. So, throughout my Master's in Science, my MSN nursing program, I have learned so much. The courses that I took helped me gain an understanding of regulating bodies, the ones that drive decision making in hospitals and in schools, helped me to conduct and critically evaluate research so that it can be applied to quality improvement projects or just to my daily work. Some of the major themes throughout the MSN program were change theory and the evaluation of change, which was a big part of even this capstone project, was to implement something new, and how are we going to evaluate that this was an effective tool. And I think we see change theory and evaluation of change as a theme throughout healthcare and healthcare policy, as well as in schools of nursing, in order to improve the quality of the care or the education that they're providing. I felt that this MSN program helped me to apply theory to practice and develop methods for implementing and evaluating change in the form of evidence-based practice changes, quality improvement, and innovation in nursing education. This capstone project was based on a couple of MSN program outcomes. The first outcome I used that I feel the Capstone project really aligns with is construct interprofessional teams to communicate, coordinate, collaborate, and consult with other health professionals to advance a culture of excellence. And if this simulation does not address that program outcome, I'm not sure what would. Because my solution to the gap was an interdisciplinary simulation. I'm constructing a team of interprofessional members. The goal of the simulation is to help these team members learn how to communicate, coordinate, and collaborate on care for patients, and this drives excellence in nursing care. It drives positive patient outcomes, and it drives nursing confidence, and the effectiveness of their procedural skills and their patient care skills in general. Even though it is geared towards new graduate nurses, it's beneficial to the entire interdisciplinary team by promoting a culture of safety through communication and collaboration. The second MSN program outcome that this capstone project closely aligns with is provide oversight and guidance in the integration of technology to manage care and identify performance measures and standards that improve quality and safety outcomes. Right there at the top it says the integration of technology to manage care. Well, the simulation obviously is the technology that we're using in this lesson in the capstone project in order to enhance the new graduate nurse's ability to manage the care of a patient and identify the patient condition. The structure allows nurses to practice those procedural, leadership, and communication skills. And simulation is a standard which has been proven to improve quality and safety outcomes. And again, it provides a safe place for these new graduate nurses to make mistakes without harming the patient. And if they can make mistakes in the simulation scenarios and learn from them, that's going to promote a culture of safety in the emergency department for those patients that they are seeing there when they're in an actual patient scenario. Overall, my experience with the MSN program has prepared me to guide the integration of simulation technology into the culture of learning in the emergency department at the University of Kansas Hospital, and I'm really excited about doing that. Overall, I'm thankful for the experience and knowledge I gained throughout the MSN program at WGU. It was a long and challenging road, but I'm happy that I took the step and decided to do it. This is only the beginning of my nursing journey. I feel confident and prepared to enter the field of nursing education, and I can't wait to see where this degree takes me next. Thank you. And I've provided my references for you there.